Right now, I'm currently messing with trdrop, a really cool open source framerate analysis tool, similar to the tools that Digital Foundry uses for their framerate analysis videos. I'm currently messing around with this to hopefully use in my videos in the near future, and I'm currently working on a piece explaining how trdrop works and how to use it. But in my tests to prove that it's working in my setup, I was reminded of how irritating framerate as a metric is. So on this episode of Reikaze Rambles, I thought I'd spend a bit of time talking about FPS. FPS, or frames per second, is the most commonly used performance metric in the world of video games. But what does FPS even mean? Video is a sequence of images presented to us. Present enough images fast enough and it looks like it's in motion. Each individual image is called a frame, so FPS is a measure of the number of frames per second. There are some pretty inherent problems to this though, mainly that it's not a metric we can relate to intuitively. It's a measure of something over seconds, but we don't experience 1 over seconds. We experience seconds, time. A great example of this flaw is when we're talking about high refresh rate displays, where FPS simultaneously doesn't convey enough information and actually misleads you a bit. Monitor refresh rates are advertised with Hertz, a metric similar to FPS, a 1 over seconds measurement. A refresh rate would pair with the FPS delivered. FPS in Hertz would indicate that a 120 display would be twice as good as a 60 Hz display, and a 240 Hz display would be twice as good as a 120 Hz display. In reality, this is not what we experience though, because we don't experience FPS. We experience frame times, the speed in which a frame is delivered. If you have a game running at 60 FPS, that means that you have an individual frame delivered to you at an average rate of 16.6 milliseconds, and at 120 frames per second, the frames are delivered at an average of 8.3 milliseconds, and at 240 Hz, it's delivered at 4.1 milliseconds each time halving. With frame times, this difference is pretty apparent. There's a smaller difference between 240 and 120 versus 120 and 60, and as such, we feel the difference less. It's a diminishing return. And it also shows why high frame rates are so hard to push. There's significantly less time for the whole processors to go through the whole rendering process. I feel like frame times even convey the benefits of high frame rate displays even better than large Hertz numbers in FPS. Because a game feels more responsive because an image is delivered faster. Sure, you can say with FPS it's more responsive because there's more data points in a given time interval, but that's inherently backwards. You're still inherently saying that it's refreshing faster. So why not just say it's refreshing faster? A lot of people I talk to get irritated by the obsession with 60 FPS, saying that it's an arbitrary number and it doesn't really matter. But I think a lot of that is because FPS doesn't convey the idea of responsiveness at all. Another big problem with frame rates is how it crushes information. An FPS number tells you nothing about the manner in which the frames are delivered. For most videos and movies, this is not a problem. Most other forms of video provide images at a consistent rate, but games can have issues delivering them at a consistent frame rate. So when they're not consistent, this change of frame rate is what most people feel, not higher or lower average FPS. Most displays present image at a fixed rate, usually 60 FPS. When a game doesn't display the information at the rate of the display, it stutters. When someone is experiencing a game that has frame rate issues, oftentimes this is not because the game is not responsive enough, but because the way that it responds to is irregular. An average FPS number can't convey this information. A game that is jumping between 45 to 60 FPS is variable, with frame time graphs showing spiking and dipping all over the place. Ironically, a common solution to variable refresh rates is to lock the FPS to a lower average. Sure, the game might be locked at a lower average number, but because it's consistent, it'll be smoother. Because the average FPS is lower, the average responsiveness isn't as fast, but you'll feel less bumps and you'll perceive a smoother experience. You might get frustrated that games often lock FPS, but this is because a locked FPS will often provide a better experience, because it's the more consistent experience. Bringing us back to why this video was made in the first place, and a great example of how FPS fails to convey information about a gaming experience is Mario Kart 8. The footage here isn't representative of the problem. trdrop has issues trying to count all the frames perfectly. This should be a 60 FPS because it is 8 Deluxe, but it got me thinking about this topic anyways. If you run Mario Kart 8 through an FPS tool like trdrop, it will spit an average of 57 FPS for most of the time, which doesn't sound like a problem at all. But this 57 FPS is an example of FPS failing as a metric, because it simultaneously undermines the problem and miscategorizes the problem itself. A 57 FPS average would indicate that it's consistently running slightly slower than 60 FPS. But Mario Kart 8 is a game that is almost always running at 60 FPS. It just has frame pacing issues, not speed issues. To have a locked 60 FPS, this means that the graphics processor in the system must be delivering the display a new frame every 16.66 milliseconds. On the frame time chart, though, you can see this happening most of the time. But because of frame delivery issues, you'll see that it'll occasionally spike up to 33 milliseconds, and this is information you really can't get from an FPS number. FPS is a bad metric because it doesn't convey information well. It doesn't convey the idea of responsiveness. It can mislead people about the gaming experience, and it often crushes important information. When talking about gaming performance, make sure to convey the experience by including information that a single FPS average might not. And using frame times to talk about gaming performance is typically a better way to convey information about performance. Thanks for watching. This has been Reikaze Rambles, signing off.